You're watching Haunted New Orleans.
It is instantly known as the haunted house. April 12th, people walking by on that same side of the street heard screams, unearthly groans from inside. And they were so convinced that whatever may be generating it must be demonic in nature, they called the likeliest person, the Roman Catholic priest. They said, "You've got to go inside and exorcise this building." The priest's response was, "Hell no." So he then hires 6 Protestant American soldiers, and they go in with him on April 16th. They go inside, and they're in for about 15 minutes, because they heard, quote, "otherworldly languages of the dead being spoken by angry spirits," unquote.
There's a period in the 1880s where the home was occupied by a variety of families. There is a woman who does make a report to a local paper. She claims she is heading towards her children's rooms, I believe, found a woman holding what she believed was her own child, I understand, and then hurls this infant down the stairs. And it turns out it wasn't hers. It was evidently the spirit of someone else's child. We don't know who. I don't know who. And there was a very similar incident shortly after that. She also made this report about going into the room, found a woman hovering over the crib, rushes towards the crib to protect her child. The woman disappears right before her and then realizes her baby has a sock stuffed in her mouth. She quickly removes it. Baby was fine. But I shudder to think that Delphine Laurie could actually affect the physical plane and actually suffocate somebody. That is just too terrible to imagine.
1953. City Council apparently even considered buying the building. But then another developer came in and said, well, we're going to do it and we're going to convert it into apartments and get people from out of town to live in them. Brilliant! And so that's precisely what they did. But of course, renovations require, among other things, putting down new floorboards. So they go in the summer of 1953 and they're about ready to put down modern plumbing. But first they rip up the old floorboards and they find underneath a lot more than old plumbing. They find 8 human skeletons. Full signs of great distress underneath the floorboards, especially when you consider the horror that the underside of the floorboards had scratch marks. 8 people had been buried alive inside that mansion. And now we know more about the legends that started about this place being haunted back in the 1830s. People hearing screams from the other side of the street. Those weren't ghosts. Those were real people underneath the floorboards begging for help. And they did not speak French or Spanish or English, but rather an obscure dialect of Senegambian. These were illegally smuggled West African slaves. They were crying out for help in the only way they knew how, which was of course then misinterpreted as otherworldly languages of the dead being spoken by angry spirits. On a different level, I have already mentioned that I'm a tour guide, and one thing that happened to me personally is that over the course of my 2.5 years being a haunted history tour guide, I have had no less than 23 people on my tours faint.
When it happens, I try to make certain it's either from dehydration, too much drinking, medical condition, before I chalk it up to direct paranormal effect from the home itself.
Andrew was our guide. He's magnificent, by the way. And I was standing taking pictures as he told of the torture and the mayhem that went on inside the house. Before we left, my daughter came to my side and told me that she was about to faint. I thought she was just feeling the heat, but soon after she went down and out. This is the first and only time she has ever fainted. She rested, and a second later she was fine. Needless to say, this ended the tour for us. And so I'm somewhat less of a skeptic now. Thanks for the great tour.
As far as visual evidence, photographic evidence from the Laurie Mansion, countless orbs have appeared in photographs. I don't jump the gun and dub every single orb as proof. There's always the possibility of dust through just the foot traffic or the motor traffic, the humidity down here, definitely, but that will give you some illusions of activity in photographs as well. But as far as people seeing things, yes, there have been a few accounts where people have actually seen what looks like smoke entering or exiting the home. There was a period where, shortly after I joined the company, My girlfriend would walk along with me on the tour, and sometimes she gets ahead of me. She knows my route. She would often get to the Laurie Mansion before me. And on a few different occasions, she would report seeing the tail of a gown going through one of the doors right there from the street. Doors we know are not actually being used. They're bolted shut. They're primarily windows these days. I have seen what I suspect was Delphine looking out of the window. At one point she was on a rear balcony. But yeah, there have been countless sightings that I can recall.
Between 1953 and 2006, it was apartments. People from all over the country and around the world will come in and stay inside, and the average length of stay was about 1 year. You know, we can still speak to a lot of them to this day.
My name is Annie Sobel. I lived in the LaLaurie house back in the mid-60s. I lived there with my father and my younger brother, Stephen. One evening, my father was walking us home from an evening out. We just come from dinner, and we were across the street on Royal, diagonally across the street. And I glanced up at the top of the building, and I saw what I could have sworn to be a child sitting on top of the roof. Looked like a little girl. She was wearing something white, and her legs were dangling over the side of the roof. And I gasped. I was a little frightened. By the time I turned to my father and I said, Dad, look up. And by the time he looked up, there was nothing there. But I saw that little girl sitting on the rooftop.
The story of the little girl, I used to see her in the courtyard. I said, "Who are you? What happened to you? Please tell me where you are, what's going on. Did she actually beat you?" and stuff like that. And she never answered me. She disappeared. I'm sure she was a slave, you know, and but couldn't see her face. She had her hair, actually, a lot of hair on her face, and she was always with the head down, sitting like that. But what can I tell you? It was frightening.
And till this day, I will neither ride by there or walk by there once it's dark, because I'm so afraid that I might see that little girl.